Morning. So it's very nice to see you all again. So today, as Adhd said, I'm going to be talking about special educational needs. And you'll see that the subheading of my talk is inclusive practices. And that's because this notion of inclusive practices is central to the Teaching for Success approach of the British Council. A lot of what I'm going to say today is obviously about special educational needs, but also a lot of it is of general application to teaching. What I want to do, first of all, is to arrive at some kind of definition of what we mean when we talk about special educational needs. Then, after that, I want to look a bit at the problem of labelling and the problem of our own prejudices when it comes to working with such learners. After that, we'll have a look at a couple of models for working with special educational needs. And then I'm going to have a section where we're going to look at broad categories of special educational needs. So I think the important word here is broad, because as we said yesterday, it's really important to see every learner as an individual, just in the same way it's important to see every teacher as an individual. So when we talk about these categories, the aim is not to categorize people, because these are very broad categories. And then finally, and most importantly, I want to look at some practical strategies for making sure that such learners are included in the learning process. And I think that these strategies are not strategies which are specific to learners with special educational needs. These are strategies that are useful for all learners. Maybe I could just say one or two words about my own experience in working with such learners. Many years ago, I used to work at a secondary school in Scotland, right in the north of Scotland, not far from Loch Ness actually. And this school, I worked in the learning support department, and so part of my brief was to work with learners with special educational needs. And then later on, I became an e-moderator for the British Council's Special Educational Needs online course. So that's something about my background in this subject. Something else I want to say at the very beginning is that I'm a teacher. I'm not a medical doctor. In actual fact, I'm not any kind of doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not a psychologist. And I know that most of the people in this room are not medical doctors or psychiatrists or psychologists, but the fact remains that as teachers, we have to work with learners who have special educational needs. And so my perspective is always coming from the perspective of a pedagogical professional, not from the perspective of a medical professional. Okay? So, let's kick off then with we'll try and arrive at a definition of special educational needs. We can say that a learner has a special educational need if special provision needs to be made for them to access the same curriculum as their peers. So, for example, this could be because somebody has a physical impairment. Maybe they need a wheelchair, and therefore the school will have to have a ramp in order for them to be able to access the same education as their peers. Although in this day and age, you would hope that ramps in schools were completely normal and that this wasn't a special provision. Or, alternatively, maybe somebody has difficulty in accessing the curriculum at a cognitive level, and therefore we have to amend and adapt the curriculum so that these learners can access it. Okay, so special provision is being made for them. So that's one definition of learners with special educational needs. But another definition is learners who perform significantly below their peers across the curriculum. Okay, so learners who perform significantly, that's the important word, below their peers, but also learners who perform significantly above the level of their peers in a range of subjects across the curriculum. Because it's often overlooked, but the fact remains that gifted and talented learners, that kind of top 5% or so, that they have special educational needs as well. So those are our kind of three broad categories of learners with special educational needs. What I want to do first of all is to look at some of the labels that these learners get labelled with, because obviously it's not helpful. So in the past, often we would say, so-and-so is so lazy, he never finishes his work. Or, so-and-so is, he's just, even sort of really ugly words like stupid might have been used in the past. Okay, so so-and-so's lazy, so-and-so's stupid, etc. And there are several problems with such labels. Okay, first of all, at the very beginning, I said that every learner is an individual, and it's important to see that individual learner, and not just to see the need or the label. Secondly, when we just label somebody as like naughty, for example, we might be missing something. Yeah? I mean, let's get something straight. If you look at the person next to you, when they were younger, sometimes they were naughty. And so are you, because it's quite normal for children to be naughty. Okay? And people or learners who are behaving, let's say, naughtier in a way which is worse than the normal behaviour of their peers, there might be a good reason for this. For instance, they might have a very unstable family life. Maybe their family life is blighted by alcohol or drugs or abuse, and that might be the reason why they are misbehaving in class. So when we just say that so-and-so is naughty, we might be missing the underlying cause, the outside issue. Or similarly, we say that so-and-so is lazy, so-and-so is slow. Whenever I write on the board, they never take the notes, they never finish it. Whenever I give everybody 20 minutes to write a short paragraph, he never finishes. Okay? Maybe there's a reason. Maybe that learner has dyslexia, which means that copying from the board is going to be extremely challenging for them, because maybe the letters are all jumbled up, maybe the letters are flipping, maybe P becomes B, or it becomes D, or N becomes U, or U becomes N, or M becomes W, or W becomes M, and so on and so on. Maybe that's the reason. And if we just say they're lazy because they never get their work done, we're missing something really important, which is preventing that learner from accessing the same curriculum as everybody else. So, labels are very unhelpful. It can blind us to the actual cause of someone's difficulties. And crucially, all learners have strengths. And when we label people and we say that they're slow, that they're naughty, that they're lazy, we just focus on the negatives. And we get in this cycle of negativity, and it's very difficult to get out of it. And it's really important to step back so that we can look at such learners' strengths. So, for example, if we have a learner in our class who has ASD, sorry for all the abbreviations, that stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder, That can be a real challenge for any teacher, because if somebody is on that autism spectrum, then it's going to be very difficult for them to integrate in the class and to carry out anything like group work, etc. And it can be very difficult to manage such learners. However, such learners have strengths. Such learners can achieve. Recently, the newspapers and television has been dominated, I would say, by Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist who is on this spectrum. She has a condition known as Asperger's syndrome, which means that, you know, she can become quite sort of focused, some people might say obsessive, about certain issues. And it's very sad to see that some politicians in the world, our leaders who should know better, have even labelled her, calling her disturbed. But in actual fact, this young lady stood up at the General Assembly of the United Nations and gave a very passionate speech in English, so not in her L1, you know, to the world's leaders, which is a tremendous achievement, I think. So that's a great example of somebody achieving. But on maybe a more everyday level, if somebody is somewhere on that spectrum, often such learners are very sort of focused and sort of quite obsessed about IT and about computers. So that strength could be utilised in the classroom. So if that learner is finding it very difficult to do pair work, to communicate with the other people in the class, why would you struggle with them? Why would you fight a losing battle? Why not utilise their strength and let them do exactly the same activity, but on the computer? Or for instance, some other learners in the class are having some problems with their IT. You could get that learner and say, you know, can you come and help your classmates sort out this IT problem? So their strengths can be utilised in the classroom. And when we label people, we don't see their strengths. But all learners have strengths. What I want to do now is to talk about a couple of models for understanding special educational needs. Now, traditionally, in the past, the model that was generally adhered to was known as the medical model. Now, what this meant was that there was an emphasis on diagnosing what the problem was. Okay? Now, obviously, it's very useful to know what the problem is, so that, you know, we can take steps to making sure that learner is included. But often in the past, what happened was that separate provision was made for such learners. These learners were often physically excluded from their peers. Now, I'm not talking, in the United Kingdom, where I come from, I'm not talking about the 19th century. I'm not talking about Charles Dickens. I'm talking about when I was a boy. So when in the 1970s and 1980s, when I was back in England visiting my family over the summer, I had the pleasure to run into somebody that I went to primary school with, and I got talking to them, and I was saying, "Oh yeah, Robert, you know, so what have you been doing since primary school?" And he told me that in actual fact, secondary school had been a very sad experience for him, because his family life was very troubled and his parents had got divorced, and this had a massive impact on him, and it was transferred into the classroom, and he started misbehaving, and as a result he was initially suspended from the school and finally excluded from the school, and he was sent to a separate school in our town, and together with other children who'd been excluded from the school for a variety of reasons. And I remember as a child how everybody in our town would make fun of the children in that school. And when I think about it now, I feel deeply ashamed, and it's sort of quite haunting, really. I feel very sorry that this happened. But in Robert's case, he emerged out of it very well, because I found out that he was a very talented musician. So despite the way that he'd been labelled, despite the way that he'd been sent away, he'd succeeded. And I found out that he played guitar on the album of none other than David Bowie. So, exactly. So, fortunately this story had a happy ending. But in the past, this was what tended to happen, that learners with special educational needs would be segregated from other learners. These days, the model which most people would adhere to is what we call the social model. So the social model is the model which is advocated by the British Council in its special educational needs materials. So the social model believes in integrating if possible, because although it's difficult, nobody's going to say that this is easy, because as we said yesterday, teaching is complex, full stop. If possible, we can integrate these learners into the learning process. Notice that I say if possible, because we have to be honest, and sometimes some learners might have such needs that separate provision needs to be made. But if possible, we can integrate such learners. And rather than educating such learners separately, we can just adapt the curriculum. Yesterday I was watching a session on lesson planning. It was a very interesting session, and at the end there were a couple of really good questions, and one of the questions was about differentiation, and the person who asked the question said, well, if you're using differentiation in the class, does that mean that you have like two separate aims? And the speaker, quite correctly, said no, you don't have two separate aims, you have the same aim, but you just have different ways of getting there. And so this is what we mean when we talk about, adapting the curriculum for learners with special educational needs. So the social model says it is possible to integrate such learners, and we can do this by adapting the curriculum rather than having a separate curriculum in a separate school. So, those are our models for understanding things. These days, the social model is the prevailing one. Okay, so what I want to do now is to talk about different categories of special educational needs. So as I said at the beginning, these are broad categories. So our first one is learners with cognition and learning problems. So learners who have such problems, these problems can be general or they can be specific. So for instance, often learners with special educational needs might perform below the level of their peers across a range of subjects, right the way across the curriculum. If somebody has severe difficulties in one subject, that doesn't mean that they've got a special educational need. That's one subject or two subjects. But right the way across the curriculum, there probably is an underlying issue. At the same time, learners have cognition and learning problems if they can't grasp an abstract idea, maybe because they're somewhere on the autism spectrum. So for instance, you might teach somebody that the past of go is went, and then you ask them what the past of go is, and they will say went, and then you'll say where did you go yesterday, but they might not be able to use went in the answer because they aren't able to apply the fact that they've learnt. Or learners with say Asperger's, they might find it very difficult to participate in something like a role play because they just don't see the point of it. Like, it's not real. Why would you pretend to be a shopkeeper or to buy a ticket at a railway station? I'm not going to do this. Because they just can't grasp that kind of abstract idea because they think so literally. And so you have to be very careful with your language. Like, and maybe cut down colourful, metaphorical language. So this is a bit of an exaggeration, but if you said something like, it's raining cats and dogs, it is possible that such a learner would sort of say, well, what do you mean? That's impossible. It can't rain cats, right? Actually water. Yeah? Okay? Because they have problems understanding abstract ideas. But, okay, so we can have like general problems, but these problems could also be very specific. So, for instance, problems with numeracy, which is called dyscalculia, or problems with basic literacy, which could be due to dyslexia. So both general and specific. And another specific learning problem could be connected with speech and language difficulties. So a learner's speech development might be significantly below the speech development of their peers. They might have specific problems with certain sounds, which means that maybe they are reluctant to engage in work in the class because they lack self-esteem. So this is our first category, cognition and learning problems. Second one, social, emotional and behavioural problems. This is probably the most controversial area for teachers, because a lot of teachers, well, a lot of people in society, full stop, will say, these people do not have special educational needs, these people are naughty. Okay? But as I said earlier, okay, I reckon a lot of people in this room have got children, right? And you know that children can be naughty. All children can be naughty sometimes, even the best behaved of children. So what are we actually talking about? Okay. If you've got a toddler, somebody who's 2 or 3 years old, right, sometimes, not all toddlers, but like they might lie on the floor, right? Kick, scream, and we have a word for it, tantrum. I can see 1 or 2 smiles as people think about their own experiences. I can even see some people laughing over there. So that kind of behaviour is age appropriate. That's normal. It's normal for toddlers to have tantrums. In English, we even talk about the terrible twos, because this is the kind of age at which this sort of behaviour appears. That is age appropriate. If somebody is 14 years old and they lie on the floor and they kick and they scream, that's not age appropriate. There's a problem there. That's something serious. That is not age appropriate. If teenagers, 15, 16, start talking about sex, it's the kind of thing that kids that age will do. If somebody who's much younger does that, somebody who's 7 or 8, that's not age appropriate. There could be a problem, a very serious problem. So when we're talking about social, emotional and behavioural problems, we're not just talking about general naughtiness. First of all, we're talking about behaviour that is not age appropriate. On the flip side of that, maybe a learner is particularly withdrawn, doesn't want to engage with their peers or their teacher, very silent. But maybe before they were happy and were happy to interact with their peers, and this change of behaviour might be indicative of a social problem or an emotional problem. General poor behaviour. So I'm sure that everybody in this room has had learners who just won't follow instructions, won't listen, won't sit still maybe sit still for a couple of minutes, then get up, go over, talk to someone else and distract them. Learners who won't put up their hand but will shout out answers. Learners who won't take turns in a game, etc. So this kind of general poor behaviour, again, rather than naughtiness, might be indicative of a broader problem. So for instance, if somebody's always shouting out the answers and they're always going, "Miss, miss, can I speak to you, miss?" etc. Won't take turns in games, stands up, constantly has to go and disrupt other people. Maybe at home they get ignored. Maybe their life at home is such a battle that they have to constantly fight for attention. And then this behaviour is then transferred into the classroom. Okay? So there could be a reason for that general poor behaviour. My next category, communication and interaction problems. So here we're talking about people who have problems working in groups. I've already mentioned autism spectrum disorder. So such learners, they might not like to make eye contact. So it's very important for me to try and make eye contact with you. But somebody who has Asperger's, for instance, if you're talking to them, they might do this. And they might talk to you like this. It's very difficult to have group work in such situations because when we work in groups, an awful lot of our communication actually takes place without words. It's with our eyes and with our hands, etc. Such people might want to work on their own. And it can be a real battle to try and get them to work with other people. And it might not even be worth trying to get them to work with other people. ADHD, so that is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So again, we're talking about kids who find it very difficult to concentrate. They find it very difficult to focus because of certain chemical imbalances that they have. Can't sit still, have to stand up, walk around. So it's very difficult for them to do group work. So if you say, okay, you've got 10 minutes to do this, that 10 minutes is going to be a very long time for them. It's going to be a real challenge and they might not make it. SEBD, so social, emotional and behavioural disorders. Okay, so we've already spoken about that. If somebody has a traumatic background, maybe they're a refugee from a conflict, maybe they've seen simply horrendous things and it's going to be really difficult for them to interact with other people. Speech and language issues. So if you have if you can't form certain sounds, and maybe your peers have made fun of you and labelled you, and maybe your teacher hasn't protected you, then in group work, maybe you don't want to say anything because you lack self-esteem. Yeah? You don't want to stick out so that they can hammer you. So the best way to protect yourself is to stay silent. It's going to be very difficult to get such learners to engage. Sensory and physical impairment. Okay, you think this is quite obvious, but not really. For example, somebody with a visual impairment, they might not even know that they have a visual impairment. It took me ages to realise that I need glasses. It was when people said, you know, hey Stephen, why are you reading the book like that? And I didn't even realise it. I'd needed glasses for years. And so a learner in the class might be in a similar situation. Maybe they're not finishing their work. Maybe they're not copying all of the things that are on the board because they can't see what's written on the board. And there they are sitting at the back of the class. And similarly, somebody might have a hearing impairment and not realise it. And you're saying they're naughty because whenever I ask them to do something, they never ever do it. Why don't they do it? Because they can't hear. They can't hear properly. And there they are at the back of the room. And we haven't even realised that. We've just said they're naughty, they're lazy, but maybe they can't hear, but they don't realise it. And the people in their family don't realise it. And lastly, physical impairments. So, for instance, people who have a wheelchair. The next category applies to societal exclusion. Again, this can be quite controversial, but we're talking about maybe learners who have a different first language. Yeah, so just having a different L1 can mean that you have a special educational need. And this is becoming increasingly urgent in Europe now because of the conflicts around the world and the rising numbers of refugees. So children who are being shifted from their homelands and ending up in other countries and ending up in classrooms where they don't speak the language. So these learners have special educational needs because they are excluded at the societal level. Okay, we've talked quite a lot about behavioural issues, but there could be medical reasons as well. So children who have HIV or AIDS, these learners have special educational needs as well because they've experienced exclusion in their society, so there might be medical reasons. And my sixth and last category is gifted and talented learners. One of the paradoxes about gifted and talented learners is that sometimes they can seem naughty. I remember having a girl in my class who would do everything. So whenever I looked at her, basically she was reading a book. And when you're a teacher, that can be pretty irritating, yeah? Like, you know, you're carrying out your lesson and there's somebody reading a book. Because she'd already completed the task. It was just like far too easy for her. Or maybe a learner is like disrupting other learners. And so you think, oh, they're naughty. But they've just finished the task early, they're bored, so they're just chatting to their neighbours. Or maybe the actual standard of their work is really poor. That it's like full of spelling mistakes and like the most unbelievably simple grammar mistakes. Why? Because it's just like too easy that it's not even worth bothering with. And so they just do it really quickly, don't even bother checking it, and then pick up their book. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that it can be really difficult to even recognise gifted and talented learners because sometimes they can appear the opposite and they can appear badly behaved, etc. So they are they have special educational needs, special provision needs to be made for them, such differentiation, for example. Okay, so those are our 6 broad categories, and you have to remember that they are very broad and that within each of those categories everybody is on a spectrum. Some people might have a condition more mildly, some people might have a condition more seriously, and so the important thing at the end of the day is to dispense with labels and to focus on the learner. What I want to do in the time that remains is to look at some inclusive strategies, what we can do to make sure that such learners have the opportunity to access the same curriculum in the same school as their peers, because this is really what we aim for as a society, to include all of the members of our society. So, inclusive strategies. As I said at the beginning, something that's really important is that these aren't special, tailored strategies for learners with special educational needs. Some of these are strategies that are important for all learners. First of all, differentiation. I'm going to go back to the presentation that I saw yesterday. I was really pleased to see somebody raise differentiation in a question at the end of the presentation because it gave rise to a really useful discussion. We should be using differentiation in our lessons anyway. Differentiation should be part of our planning anyway, because if you ask any teacher in any school in any part of the world what the biggest problem they face is, they will say multi-level classes. My classes are really difficult to teach because I've got 30 kids, some of them are really bright, some of them find it really difficult, and then you've got a whole load of levels in between. Yeah. That's a fact. That's a normal classroom. You can't have a class of 30 kids where all of the kids have exactly the same level of knowledge. It just doesn't happen. We're talking about the real world here. So differentiation is a fact. And so we need to think about that at the planning stage. How am I going to make sure that all of my learners are involved? And you're now saying, aha, you're arguing against yourself, because yesterday when you started speaking you said that one of the greatest challenges for continuing professional development is the burden, the work burden placed upon teachers. But I'm going to tell you that I don't think that differentiation involves a lot of extra work. I actually don't think it involves any extra work. What it does require is for a bit of reflection to think about what the problems are and what the solution is. So for instance, if my learners are doing some writing, imagine that they have to write an email to a friend of 30 words, or a postcard to a friend of 30 words. Now all of the learners in the class can have the same outcome, like they produce that email. And most of them probably can write 30 words. But maybe I've got some gifted and talented learners in my class, and probably I do, because they're about 5 to 10% of the population. So in a class of 30, I've probably got 3, 4, 5 of them. They don't have to write 30 words. They can write 50 words. They can write 60 words. And maybe I've got some learners who have dyslexia, or maybe I have learners who have a different L1. And so it's really challenging for them to write 30 words. So they could just write one sentence. They could write 10 words. Or maybe they could do it in pairs. Now, to say that somebody, most of the class are going to write 30 words, some of them are going to write 60 words, and some of them are just going to write 15 words, that doesn't require a lot of extra preparation. It doesn't require any extra preparation at all. It just needs a little bit of thought. All we've done to differentiate the task is we've extended it for some learners and we've shortened it for some others. Or let's take an example of a vocabulary recycling game. So maybe you're using it as a warmer at the beginning of the lesson, or maybe you're using it at the end of the lesson just to review some of the vocabulary that you've done. And let's say that the learners have to have to guess words. They have to guess words. So gifted and talented learners, maybe they've got the word and they can explain the word verbally. So this is obviously quite demanding, but they're gifted and talented, so they should be able to do it. And then maybe some other learners who don't have the same verbal skills, well, maybe they could act the meaning of the word, or they could draw the meaning of the word on the board, like Pictionary we call it. So 3 different ways of doing the same activity. Some for more gifted learners, some for learners who don't have the same kind of verbal skills. Differentiation. It doesn't take a lot of, you don't have to produce any extra material, it's just a decision. You just have to think about it before you do it. So the same outcome, but different ways of getting there. Maybe some learners can produce a piece of writing or can speak without any support, but maybe some others will benefit from having frames, from having more linguistic input, more scaffolding. So differentiation is just a question of providing a bit more scaffolding, taking away a bit of scaffolding. So we're not talking about producing a completely new set of materials and having to stay up all night. If you're doing that, that's not really what differentiation is. Differentiation can be something as simple as they have to do 10 questions in an exercise. Okay, most of them can do 10, but some of them could do every other one. Okay, and some of them maybe they could do one of the other exercises further on. Okay, so differentiation is the cornerstone of inclusive practices. You're going to involve more of your learners, and you're going to involve learners with special educational needs if you can successfully differentiate. And even when we work with other teachers, In teacher training, you will probably have to differentiate certain activities because we're all individuals and we work at different speeds. Having visual reminders can bring more people into the lesson and can particularly manage behaviour. So yesterday, I can't remember who it was, somebody spoke about having like classroom rules on the wall. So if people are like interrupting, if people are standing up and walking around, you can just point to the rules on the wall, which is much more effective than having to explain the rules from the very beginning. And such rules, of course, are most effective when the learners themselves come up with those rules. Because when the learners produce the rules, then it's the nature of a contract. And you can say, hey, sorry, didn't make up the rules, you made up the rules. Okay? So having rules around the classroom. But visual reminders can also be used to keep learners focused on the time. So learners who have ADHD find it difficult to concentrate. You could have a traffic light system. So when you've got your green light up, it means, okay, you've still got time. Amber, time's running out, you need to start finishing. Red. Okay? Because maybe such learners are not really sort of paying attention when you give your instruction. And so these visual reminders will help to reinforce them. Okay? And obviously, the gestures that we use are important too. Where we stand in the classroom. So these are non-verbal routines. Before you give an instruction, it's absolutely vital that you get everybody's attention. And it's best practice to do this in the same way as a routine. So, for instance, I just go. But I know a teacher who had a tambourine, and she used to shake her tambourine, and everyone knew that an instruction was coming up. I've seen teachers who raise both hands, stand in the middle of the classroom. It looks very dramatic, and everyone stops what they're doing. They know that an instruction is coming up. And so when we give these instructions, if we can give them in the same way, non-verbally, that helps. So pair work is and so on. But if we always do it in the same way and it becomes a routine, it's going to be easier for people who find it difficult to concentrate to follow that. And also like in correction as well, if you use finger correction, that your learners quickly associate, I know that means third person, that's past tense, etc. So it's a routine. We all appreciate routines. Routines help us navigate through the lesson, and it's particularly important for not just learners with special educational needs. All learners benefit from these kinds of non-verbal routines. Clear instructions. I could talk until the cows come home about clear instructions. Now, there are very few teachers, if any, in the entire world who can claim to always give clear instructions. If you asked me, one of my weaknesses as a teacher, I would say, as a trainer, sometimes the instructions I give really aren't clear. Maybe I'm being a bit conservative in the use of my words sometimes. And when I observe teachers, I often find that a cause of a lot of the problems that might occur, when they occur, is down to the way that the instructions were given. And this is absolutely no surprise, because giving instructions, in my opinion, is actually quite a complex business. The business of setting up a task, telling people what they have to do, what's expected at the end and how long they've got to do it. It's quite complex really, and it's not a surprise when things go a little wrong sometimes. So we shouldn't feel bad about the fact that we don't always give clear instructions, but it is something that most teachers can work on. So, you know, what makes a good instruction? Well, as I've already said, making sure that you have everybody's attention. Get your tambourines out. The language itself needs to be quite clear. The language, ideally, needs to be chunked. So what do I mean when I say chunked? Well, for instance, it's no good saying, okay, get your books out of your bags, turn to page 27, exercise A, question number 2. Can you repeat the instruction, please? Okay, it needs to be chunked, yeah? So, take your books out of your bags, wait till they do it, page 27, wait till they do it, and so on. So good instructions are chunked. If you've got learners with special educational needs, well, in actual fact, all learners have different needs anyway. It's a good idea to give instructions in using a variety of modes. One of the problems is that as teachers, we all have certain biases. So for instance, if we enjoyed learning using an auditory mode, then as teachers, probably we're going to enjoy teaching using an auditory mode. But then that's a bit of a problem if somebody prefers to see things. So when giving instructions, it's also useful to have the instructions in some kind of visual form. We could project them, we could write them on the board, we could have a handout. So if somebody didn't hear it, they can always refer to the board, or they can refer to the handout. But of course, if we actually demonstrate what's required, pair, that's going to be even more effective. Okay, so to think about the different modes of giving clear instructions. Yesterday in the presentation on lesson plans, there were some more abbreviations. People were talking about ICQs. Do you remember what ICQs were? Yeah, these were instruction checking questions. So if you think that somebody's not going, there's a chance that they might not be following, so you're anticipating your problems, you can always check the instruction. Yeah? So take your books out of your bags, go to page 27. Is it page 27 or page 28? Which one? 27, thank you, yeah. So I think one of the important things about ICQs is to make sure that they're closed questions, because if you say which page, open question, then there's more chance of something going wrong. If it's a closed question, then there's more chance of them showing that they've understood there. So what we see is that actually giving an instruction is quite a complex thing. You need to make sure that you have everybody's attention. You need to make sure that the language that you're using is quite simple. You need to make sure that it's chunked. You need to check how many different modes that you're using in. So if somebody can't hear very well, they can see it. It's a good idea to demonstrate it. It might be necessary to check it. In short, it might be a good idea to plan your instructions. So that was something that was sort of came up in the session yesterday. I think that doesn't take very long, just to think or make a note for yourself. This is a complex instruction, make sure I chunk it or make sure I check it. But at the same time, yesterday, I was talking about the danger of becoming an automatician, as Penny calls them sometimes, is that we don't ICQ all the time when we know that somebody's understood it, because then we're not reflecting, we're not actually thinking about what we're doing. Yeah, I spoke yesterday about the importance of variety. Variety is the spice of life, so a multisensory approach is important. So if things are repetitive, if we have learners who have difficulty, if they have dyslexia, then obviously they're going to find any reading activity difficult, writing activity difficult. So it's important that we have plenty of listening for them as well, plenty of speaking opportunities for them as well. That basically, if we use a multisensory approach, we cover more bases and we're going to include more learners. So we need to dispense with our own biases. Praise is a very obvious thing. I really enjoyed Simon's point yesterday about private praise. It's really important with learners who have behavioural issues to reinforce good behaviour and to tell them when they're behaving well, so that you say, "Oh, Ivan, I'm really glad to see that you're on task. Well done there." Okay, it's really nice to see that you're sitting down, Ivana. Good. Okay, and that kind of praise would be particularly effective when given privately. So it's important to positively reinforce good behaviour. As I said before, focus on the strengths of the learner, not just the things that they can't do, but on what they can do. So, as I said, the learner with ASD maybe has fantastic computer skills. Let them work on the computer. If somebody has dyslexia, or if somebody has dyspraxia, so dyspraxia means that they might be a bit clumsy and they find it very difficult, like actually holding a pen and writing might be difficult, let them use the computer, let them use that strength, yeah? And then you get a piece of writing which is neater, doesn't have so many spelling mistakes, etc. And lastly, it's not a very obvious point, but when we're talking about planning, I mean, how many of us think where people are going to sit? So if somebody has an auditory impairment or a visual impairment, what are they doing sitting at the back of the class? If somebody has ADHD and finds it really difficult to focus and sit still, what are they doing sitting at the back of the class? Okay, maybe, I'm not saying put them at the front, I'm just saying if you have them a bit closer, so somebody with a visual impairment or an auditory impairment, they're closer to the board, they're closer to the teacher, it's going to be easier for them to know what's going on. If somebody has ADHD, and they're finding it difficult to focus, you can intervene more quickly if they're a bit closer to you than if they're at the back of the class. Also, think about who they're sitting with. If somebody has ADHD, maybe it's a good idea to get them to sit with a learner who provides a good model of focus and concentration and somebody who can help them. Similarly, learners who are gifted and talented, sometimes they benefit from working with learners who are much weaker than them because they can help them, they can instruct them, and that boosts their self-esteem. But sometimes they need to sit with other learners of a similar ability so they can produce a more ambitious product. So at the end of the day, we keep coming back to this idea of reflection and thinking about what's going on in the lesson. And the question is, how can I involve as many learners as possible in my lesson, including those with special educational needs, because all learners have the right to be included in the lesson, and I don't need to develop any radically new practices, I just need to use sound practices which are applicable to all learners. Thank you very much.